Hi, everyone, and welcome back into the Comics Lair for our discussion of Monica Rambeau. The Comics Lair is sponsored by Heroes Aren't Hard to Find and their annual Heroes Convention. Now, I do have to warn you that there will be some minimal spoilers. If you are one of those few people on the planet who is interested in WandaVision and hasn't yet watched it all the way through, or intends to see the Captain Marvel movie and has not yet done so, there will be some spoilerish things in here, and you might want to come back and view this panel after you have watched those. I'm your host, Nancy Northcott, and my guests this evening are Dan Jolley and Bobby Nash. And I'd like to start by asking each of them to introduce himself and tell us a little about his involvement with comics in general and Monica Rambeau in particular. Bobby, you want to start?
Sure. Hi, I'm Bobby. I've been writing comics for a long time. I think my first professional comic came out in 2000. But I'd done some local stuff and stuff like that beforehand. These days I write comics here and there. Mostly I'm writing novels and things like that these days, but lots of fun. And we're probably going to spoil some 35-year-old comic stories too for anybody that's curious.
Yeah.
My name is Dan Jolley, and I've been writing comics for 31 years. Started out writing for Dark Horse and then DC and Marvel and basically all of the other major ones in the country. Probably best known for co-creating the Jason Rusch version of Firestorm for DC. But like Bobby, I'm mainly writing novels these days too. I still do the occasional comic, but yeah, I'm primarily a novelist now.
Okay. Well, we decided before we started recording that there are 3 incarnations of Monica Rambeau. The first and the most developed occurred obviously in Marvel Comics. The second is in the Captain Marvel movie, and the third was in the miniseries WandaVision. So we'll start with the comics character first. And as a bit of background for anyone who's not familiar with the character from the comics, Monica made her debut in Amazing Spider-Man Annual number 16 in 1982. She was a member of the New Orleans Harbor Patrol and helped a family friend who was concerned about his research being used to develop a weapon on an oil rig offshore. She destroyed the weapon and, long story short, ended up absorbing its energy. And that gives her the ability to assume the form of any electromagnetic energy. Because her family friend, the scientist she was helping, mistakenly called her Capitan, even though she was a lieutenant in the Harbor Patrol, and a guard called her Capitan Marvel, she took the name Captain Marvel and was the first human character to bear that name after Marvel the Kree. And then she begins exploring her new powers, subsequently joins the Avengers, becomes their leader, and has a long and varied career. So let's start with that origin. How did you all react to reading that origin for a superhero? Dan, you want to start?
Well, I was a kid. I was a little kid. I think I was 10 when it came out, and I mean, superhero origins are so varied. Just trying to come up, well, Bob, you know what I'm talking about. Trying to come up with anything original for a superhero is almost impossible.
There's a checklist.
Yeah, trying to come up with an original superhero name is virtually impossible because they're all owned by DC or Marvel. So, I thought the origin was really, really cool. The origin itself was not the part that had the biggest impact on me. We were talking before the panel started a little bit. I was talking about this. I was reading comics from the time that I could read. So at that time, that had been about 4 years. And to me, it was like I was being presented with all these real people. Peter Parker absolutely was Spider-Man. The Fantastic Four absolutely were Reed Richards and Sue Storm and Johnny Storm and Ben Grimm, and that was just the way it was. It was like I was being told, okay, here's this person, and they have this identity, and this is what they do and where they are, and there's no changing that. And all of a sudden, Captain Marvel, who in the Marvel universe was, it was like you mentioned, a Kree who looked like a white guy. All of a sudden, there was a different Captain Marvel, and it was this black woman who was awesome and powerful, and it just kind of blew my little 10-year-old mind. Just the concept that you could take in a somewhat established or a very established identity and change that to say, no, this is still Captain Marvel. It's Captain Marvel, but now it's a different person, and it's a woman, and she does different things. And it just opened up a whole universe of possibilities. And I think that's part of what led me to years later when DC came and said, hey, we want you to reboot Firestorm, but we want it to be really, really different and really fresh. And I was like, well, does it have to be the same person? Can it be a new person? They were like, oh yeah, different person, sure. Tell us more. And I was like, well, okay, if it's a different person, does it have to be a white person? And they said, oh, yeah, okay, it's going to be a black person. Tell us more. And that's what led to that. And so some of the seeds of that, I think, go right back to Monica Rambeau putting on that amazing costume and suddenly becoming Captain Marvel.
Yeah, my first introduction to her was actually in the Avengers. I didn't read the Spider-Man story until I got to know her in the Avengers, and I found out she had, started elsewhere, and I went and, found the issue. And she was just, I thought she worked really well in the Avengers, the way she, she starts out as like they acknowledge that she's new, she's learning stuff, she's training, she became our intro to the Avengers, because we were, she's the outsider that can ask those questions that, the Avengers can explain things to her and to the reader, because she needs to know them. But I love the origin. I went back and read it. Marvel, especially back in those days, had a habit of using the annuals to introduce new characters. And because the annuals almost always were out of phase with the rest of the continuity,
Yeah, they're standalone stories.
Yeah. So they rarely, were a big impact. So they could try out new characters, and if they didn't work, you just never saw them again. But if they did work, now she's got that Spider-Man tie, and then I believe after that she shows up in Marvel 2-in-1 with the Thing, and then from there to the Avengers. So, and it is notable. I mean, Roger Stern, I believe, wrote, if not all of those, most of those. And, I know he was integral in crafting the character and how she acted and how she was portrayed. And yeah, good stuff. It was just a wonderful character.
See, I was totally ignorant about Monica because, as I was telling Bobby and Dan before the panel started, I grew up reading mostly DC. So when Monica Rambeau appeared on screen in WandaVision, it was kind of like, well, this is kind of an interesting character. I mean, she was okay in the Captain Marvel movie, but she's a little girl and she doesn't have a whole lot to do in that movie. And so as I went back and read the origin, it was interesting to me that she became a superhero as an adult. Mm-hmm. She didn't grow up in a superhero community. She didn't acquire powers at a delicate phase in her life. I mean, kind of a delicate phase because she just had a big falling out with her boss, but not in the sense that most teenagers develop superpowers. Mm-hmm. And she was interesting to me too, in that very few comic book characters have two living parents. Right. I mean, Silver Age Superboy had two living parents who were in on all of his secrets, but that's rare that a superhero's parents are alive and are around to be involved.
And not secretly evil.
Not secretly evil. So, I mean, you all both write comics as well as other things. Why do you think it is that there's such resistance to having a heroic character have actual parents?
it just goes, I think it's just a tradition thing, because the older, when comics started, Superman goes, his planet blows up, no parents. Bruce Wayne, parents murdered. Peter Parker, no parent. It seemed like it was just the thing. Um, like one of the best things I thought about, this is not Monica Rambeau related, but one of the greatest things I thought they ever did was when, after Crisis, when DC rebooted, was the fact that Ma and Pa Kent were still alive when Clark was an adult. I thought that was just absolutely brilliant. And so you're right, it adds that dynamic of someone to talk to, or somewhere you can go when when you need you need your family to either smack you upside the head or give you the shoulder to cry on or whatever. And if I remember, as I remember, her parents, quickly put her back in line when she kind of was, woe is me, that, especially I believe her mother was quick to get her, smack her upside the head, go back to, you got work to do.
Part of it is kind of a logistical issue as well, because a big chunk of the stuff that I do is like middle grade fiction, and when you've got stories where you've got kids who have amazing powers or are involved in amazing circumstances and they want to go through some sort of dimensional portal or go off and fight some supervillains or whatever, any decent parent is going to say, no, what are you, crazy? Go clean your room. And, if you've got one parent, then that's, you have to circumvent, sneak off so the one parent doesn't know what you're doing, or make believe you're at your friend's house instead of going to fight trolls or whatever. And if you've got two parents, it's twice as hard to justify a kid protagonist going off and doing something horrendously dangerous. It's stands a good chance of getting them killed. I think that's one reason why hardly any Disney protagonist has both parents. Usually it's the father who's still alive, and I think that might be because, in general, I think fathers might be slightly easier to fool than mothers. And so it's storytelling convenience.
Yeah,
might be a factor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I've seen people say that they think, especially with adult heroes who have parents, in some genres, it's like if you have a parent, you have this authority figure you have to answer to, even if you're an adult. And so that complicates the story, not necessarily in exactly the same way, but it creates an obstacle. And I know when Tim Drake first came along, at least his dad was still alive. And he was not down with his son doing this whole Robin thing when he found out about it. But then he was conveniently killed off, and that was sort of the end of that problem. But I remember there was an issue where Monica had been hurt, I think, and she wanted to get back to the Avengers, and she couldn't understand why they were not reaching out to her. And then she found out her mother was intercepting the communications, and they had kind of a thing. Mm-hmm. About, this is not your little territory. This is my territory. And it's interesting because at some point, I think we all have to do that when we reach adulthood, to say, I appreciate your help. That's great, but I got this. And it was interesting to me that happened with Monica's mother, because I could totally see somebody's mother or father, for that matter, doing that. Mm. And intercepting it.
Well, it also seems like a lot of times now with the superhero movies or the comic book movies, they are moving a bit away from that, so that there are some family dynamics kept in there. I mean, Peter Parker had Aunt May, but like the Ant-Man movies, they made it a point that it's Hank Pym and his daughter, or in Captain Marvel, we see Monica and her mother. So it feels like, and there's a lot of WandaVision about, she's reacting to finding out that her mother's gone. There's a lot of that. And so it seems like the movies do it more than the comics do.
Yeah. Shazam, Billy had his found family with the foster parents and the other kids there, and his encounter with his mother didn't go what we might call very well. So, but he really already had a family in place.
Well,
And
plus, I think in the comics too, because comics, like the movies, as cool as they are, there's going to be a beginning and ending. At some point, Robert Downey Jr. goes, "I'm done." Iron Man's, gone. The comics, these stories never end. They, individual stories might, but the books continue on and the characters continue on, and they don't really age. So when you introduce other things like that, like, uh, Aunt May had one foot in the grave for what, 40 years,
yeah, yeah.
and before they decided, you know what, they kind of de-aged her a little almost. Or when Reed and Sue had Franklin, Franklin was 5 forever, and then one day suddenly he's a teenager. It's like those kind of things, are harder to, because you do stretch things out. They haven't, Peter Parker hasn't been Spider-Man for 50 years in real life, in the comic life, just in the real world.
Right. Well, I'd had the impression, I'd be interested to know whether you all think it's a valid one, because you're more familiar with the Marvel universe than I am, that in general, Monica went about her business with the Avengers, and the focus was on the Avengers.
Mm-hmm.
And her family really wasn't in it all that much, that they were like Ma and Pa Kent in Smallville now. Every once in a while we go visit them.
Mm.
Is that a fair description?
Yeah, I think so. Well, she also, like Superman, had the ability to get from New York to Louisiana like that. So she could pop in for 2 or 3 panels, pop back to New York, probably, deal with whatever. Because there were some times where she would go and there would be like subplots of things going on. I believe they were building up a relationship with her and like a detective in Louisiana at one point, and she was helping him solve a case, things like that. But yeah, but with her power, she could be back and forth really quick.
That's handy. Dan, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, just I think comics in general. This might be like fodder for an entirely different panel, but they're just not very realistic in like a few specific ways. Like Robbie was talking about, nobody ages, stories go on forever, and people in comics, even people who are not immortal beings of energy or aliens or demigods or whatever, even ordinary humans, go through things every issue that an ordinary person would spend the rest of their life in therapy dealing with. And yeah, no, they don't emphasize the family relationships at all. I mean, half the time people are sitting around Avengers Mansion in their superhero costume. And I think that's one improvement that the movies made, is that you do see, like Tony Stark, when he doesn't have to be wearing a suit, he parks it, steps out of it. I don't know. I think I'm drifting away from topic.
Well, but it's the groups are kind of like found family for the characters.
Yeah.
And it seems like a lot of fans really kind of glommed onto that in the beginning. And Monica doesn't need a found family because she's got a family. But of course, that doesn't keep her from developing these ties with the Avengers either.
Right.
And then she at one point lost her powers. And that seems to be kind of an unusual. I mean, yes, Superman periodically loses his power. And actually reading this sort of reminded me of when they turned Superman into an electron, because he could go through phone wires and do things. I'm thinking, well, it looks to me like Monica got there first on that. But, okay, I'm sorry. I just lost my train of thought there. But when she lost her powers, at one point she started to kind of get them back. And did they explore the effect of losing her powers on her in those issues. Were you all reading Avengers at that time?
I think the losing the power thing was after the Avengers. I think. Because I know she kind of leaves after she is out of the Avengers. We don't see her for quite some time.
Right.
I don't remember how long exactly, but she kind of disappears, and then I believe she would get like a one shot here or there. Or she would show up as a guest star in something else, because they got to keep the copyrights, even if we're not using the
Right.
characters,
Right.
we got to see them ever so often, and especially that name, because Captain Marvel name is so highly contested with different companies. You don't want that trademark or that copyright to lapse. So I don't remember the losing the power storyline per se, but I think it was after the Avengers.
If I recall correctly, she had become like way more powerful than she was to begin with, and had become kind of like this immortal, godlike being, and then had to expend so much of her energy that it returned her to her human form.
What I saw online said that she was fighting a giant sea creature called Leviathan and spread her electricity in the water so thinly or over such a diffuse area that she had difficulty reincorporating.
Okay, that was in the Avengers. Okay, I do remember that now.
Okay.
That was right near the end of her time on there.
Well, that would make sense. And
I believe that may have been the reason she left the team. I have this image in my head too of her, the human part of her looking quite older, like she was depleted, like shrunken, and but yeah, I don't know. Other than that, I do remember that battle and that issue, but I think that might have been why she left the book. I should have done more reading before.
well, it's very difficult to pin these things down. If you don't have the issue and you can't pull out a long box and pull it. Online summaries tend to be very vague about when. And
well, I also believe that era, not all of it's in trade form either, so it's not as easy to go out, and I don't think they're up to that point in the Epic collections yet.
Yeah.
And they're getting close. I know they've gotten to points early in her time with the Avengers, but yeah.
Well, there was an issue of Ultimates where she and Carol Danvers, Captain Marvel, were working together to clear New Orleans harbor of these mysterious wrecks of ships and planes. And nobody was really sure why they were crashing. But there was some nice byplay between the characters in there. And for example, Monica told Carol, "You really should have called me before you took the Captain Marvel name back." And Carol's like, "Well, you weren't using it." And Monica's like, "Yeah, should have called me anyway." And as you go through the end of the story, Carol does in fact admit, "Yes, I should have called you anyway." And one of the things that was really interesting about that story was that Monica essentially said she had PTSD from this fight with Leviathan. And she said, "I'm not going in the water. If anybody's going in the water, it's going to have to be you, because I'm not doing that." And of course, then the story, as stories do, pushed her about that assumption, about that policy. And that's something I haven't seen a whole lot of with superheroes either, is like, I went through this thing and now I can't do this. And can you all think of anybody else that would apply to?
Off the top of my head, I'm sure it's happened, but it usually gets resolved quickly. Like, I'm afraid of snakes. They end up in a snake pit at the end of the issue, and
yeah,
I'm fine now.
That's exactly what I was thinking of, but it was Indiana Jones.
Yeah.
Who, I think by any kind of definition would qualify as a superhero, honestly.
Well, he's not dead yet after everything he's been through. So,
well, you drink from the cup of Christ, you might get some benefits out of that.
true. That might help you a little bit.
When I was first starting at DC, one of the editors that I worked with several times, Joey Cavalieri. Joey Cavalieri, great guy, brilliant guy, fantastic editor, and I learned a lot from him. And one of the things that, because I was writing an inventory story, which I don't even know if they do inventory stories anymore, but it was one that could
Explain
just,
what that, excuse me, Dan, could you explain what that is for people who are not familiar with the term?
yeah, at least once upon a time. If comics have to come out once a month. They're supposed to come out once a month, but sometimes the creative team just can't quite make it to once a month. Life happens, for whatever reason, and an issue is going to be late. So, in anticipation of that, an editor will commission a certain number of inventory stories, and that is a story that features the character that the series stars in a 1-issue or maybe 2-issue story that is unlinked to the current continuity. It stands alone. The action happens, and the character status quo at the end is right back at the beginning where it started. So if an issue is going to be late, you can just pull out an inventory story and slot it in, and the comic series doesn't miss a month. So back at the beginning of my career, I did a few inventory stories for DC and some for Valiant, and I was doing a Flash story for Joey, and he was telling me his philosophy about heroes, superheroes, because it was DC Comics, but just heroes in general. That he thinks the important thing to see in a hero story is that they cannot do something, and yet they must. And she could not go in the water, and yet she had to. Indiana Jones could not be around snakes, but he had to jump in the snake pit. Maybe the Flash, who can move at the speed of light, was supposed to be in 2 places at once. Well, it doesn't matter how fast you are, really. If you have to be in New York and Beijing at the same time, you can't, and yet he had to. That's just that fits in exactly with Monica Rambeau's PTSD and with the needing therapy that I was talking about earlier.
Yeah. We know one of the things that sets DC fans off about Nightwing, aside from the whole Rick saga in general, was the lack of really dealing with his issues, the amnesia, I don't want to be a superhero, but I can't help being a superhero, and nobody ever called him on it, and they never explored it. And people were saying at the time that, yeah, these scenes with Scarecrow as his therapist, yeah, that's therapy. He got some therapy, but you can't fill page after page of a comic book with a character undergoing therapy or family drama, because that's not what people buy the comic book for.
You shouldn't. There have been
Yeah.
comics that have tried to do that.
Yeah.
You shouldn't.
Probably the best one that ever managed to walk the line were the early Spider-Mans, because they are as action-packed as they are. In the back of their mind, it's like, Aunt May needs her medicine. Why can't I get a date for Saturday night?
Yeah, it does seem like personal issues and angst in general are confined to a couple of panels here and there, and eventually they might seed something that goes through a couple of panels here and there for an issue or 3 or 4 or however many, and then you have a subplot in an issue where it kind of gets resolved. And I don't know how extensively Monica's PTSD was explored, because at the time, that was 1988 that she lost her powers. And I don't think PTSD was something people were so cognizant of
Right.
back then.
I'm not sure. I admit I have not read a lot of the stuff that happened later, because I know she showed up in a few other places. She was in a team group. I forget the year Warren Ellis was writing it. New Wave, Next Wave, something like that.
Next Wave,
Was
yeah.
it Next Wave? I know she appeared in that, but I did not read that title, so I'm not sure what was dealt with her in there.
She was in a group for a while called Agents of Hate that was against terrorism. And I think she was in a group called Infinity that ran like through a mini series, and that was it. And then there's Ultimates. But I had sort of thought that with the huge success of the Black Panther movie, that there would be more of an effort on the part of both DC and Marvel to play up the Black heroes on their roles. And that doesn't really seem to have been happening all that much.
Well, there's the sequel to Captain Marvel is going to be called Marvels, or The Marvels. And I think we're going to get a good bit of both Monica Rambeau and Kamala Khan in that. And I mean, she's not Black, but she's a person of color.
Right.
So maybe
it would be cool. It would be cool to see. Like, I don't know if Monica appears in comics right now, like in the actual comics. I think sometimes the comic companies miss and I know you can't make comics on a dime. It is a time-consuming process. I get that. But if you go to the movies and you say you watch, or you watch WandaVision, oh my God, this is an awesome character. Everybody's talking about how awesome she is. I want to go read a Monica Rambeau comic. You can't find one unless you go looking for back issues of the Avengers, and unless do some research, you don't know she's in those. So I think sometimes it's, people, we're not getting enough people coming from the theater or from the viewing experience over to the comic side. And when we do, there's nothing there for them to recognize. Like, by the time you get Sam Wilson as Captain America on TV, he's not that in the comic anymore.
Right.
So unless now there are trades where you can read stories of Sam as Captain America, but it's not the current comic. So people sometimes go, well, that's not anything like what I just watched. I don't want that. So I think sometimes there's disconnect between different sides of Marvel and DC and Warner Brothers and whatnot.
Yeah, and it's hard to pinpoint exactly how these opportunities get missed. I did the teen novelization of the movie Iron Man, and they sent me the screenplay for the movie a year before the movie came out. And a year is enough time if the Iron Man office at Marvel had decided to mold the comics after what happened in the movie, they could have. But at the same time, sometimes the movie studios get weird about it, and there are weird licensing issues. Like, I was supposed to be writing the video game based on Spider-Man 4 before the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man 4 before it got canceled. And they had licensed Spider-Man to this video game development studio, but they did not license any of the story from the movie. They said, go and make a video game based on Spider-Man 4, but you can't make it about Spider-Man 4. In fact, they wouldn't even let us have a copy of the script. They would let someone go to the place that they had the script and sit in a room for like an hour and make notes, and then they had to leave the copy there. So, there is enough time if everybody cooperates, but the reasons why people don't cooperate are just really bizarre sometimes.
Yeah. It didn't happen to me, but one of the funniest stories I heard about this, Max Allan Collins wrote Road to Perdition, the book. The movie was eventually made based on the book. He was hired to write the novelization of the movie. And so in writing the novelization of the movie based on the book he created, he put in things because there's a lot you have to fill it out, because a screenplay would be a very short novel if it was just the screenplay.
Yeah.
And he put things in there from the original book and was told he couldn't because they were not part of the movie. And so it was like, they're telling him how he can write his own story. So it's a weird business.
And, like it would make sense to me, and I'm sure I'm not the first one to come up with this idea because I have a habit of reinventing the wheel. But it seems like you should have a stand with comics sitting outside where the people leave the theater. People walking out of Captain America Winter Soldier, if there had been a great big spinner rack full of Captain America, full of the Winter Soldier storyline, the comics, I think they might have sold some comics. But I didn't see any comics outside the theater.
I've always said too, if you had DVDs of these movies outside the theater, I would probably walk out and buy a lot of them. And,
Well, it takes what, about 5 months to produce a comic book from concept to on the rack?
yeah, give or take.
Something
Yeah.
like that.
I mean, it depends. I mean, there are those instances where one person is doing everything, and so there are shortcuts. But if you're looking at like a writer, a penciler, an inker, a color, different people, yeah, I mean, each of those people has to have time to do the work, and there's an editorial step between each of them.
And then there's printing,
yeah,
distribution.
Yeah, so you have to have it in the catalog, 2-3 months before it's in the stores. I mean, it's a process.
Well, it seemed like, and I'd be curious to know if this was y'all's impression as well, that all 3 of the superhero movies that came out, Wonder Woman, Black Panther, and Aquaman, all far exceeded the studio expectations when they released them. I mean, they blew the top off the charts.
Yeah.
And so WandaVision was huge. And yet Monica, who's kind of the breakout character from WandaVision, hasn't gotten any dividends from that.
Right.
And it just seems odd. I mean, we were saying earlier that she's kind of the best character nobody pays attention to.
Well, even if you go right now to the comic stores, there are no comics with the Vision or Wanda in them currently being produced, to my knowledge.
Well, I think Wanda, spoiler alert, got killed in X-Men.
Oh, okay. See.
Recently, but I'm not reading X-Men, so
well,
I know.
Death in comics is yeah. I mean, I think the only character that ever stayed dead was Uncle Ben. It used to be Uncle Ben and Bucky, but they brought Bucky back. So
yeah, even Jor-El and Lara came back for a while, decades ago in a purely imaginary story. Like they're not all, but yeah.
I used to love seeing that on the covers. Not a hoax, not an imaginary story. I'm like,
there was. Let's see, who was it? It was my old boss at my first video game job back at Icarus Studios. He was telling me about a conversation he had with a kid at a con, and this kid was like 12, and the kid was telling my boss that there was no way that Spider-Man could join the Avengers because the missions that the Avengers went on were way too dangerous, and Spider-Man would get killed, and then they would have to cancel all Spider-Man's other books. And it's like kind of like the way I was looking at things when I first read that Spider-Man annual with Monica Rambeau being introduced. Like I thought that these were, to me, like real people, like permanent entities. But it's really not like we're looking into a window into another, looking through a window into another world where we're watching the adventures of these real people. These are all just fictional characters that people like Bobby and I mess with as we see fit. Yeah. Is Monica Rambeau's PTSD being addressed? Depends on the writer.
Yeah.
Depends on what the editor tells the writer to do. Can Spider-Man beat Galactus? Depends on the writer.
Yeah, because everyone comes in with their own takes on things, or sometimes editorial will say, we want you to go in this direction with the characters. Yeah. Sometimes it's just like, yeah, the PTSD thing wasn't well received, ignore it. Or it was really well received, let's play with it. You never know. Company dictates, because doing cons, I meet people all the time that are like, man, if I was writing Spider-Man, I was like, yeah, if you were writing Spider-Man, you would do what the people writing Spider-Man now do. Go, yes, sir. That's exactly what I'll do.
Yeah.
Because
Spider-Man is a giant cash cow.
Oh yeah.
And the people who own Spider-Man tell the writers what to do.
Yeah. So I mean, it's a, writing comics is a very creative thing, but yeah, they're not, unless you create it yourself, you are beholden to those, your corporate overlords, so to speak. And it's just like any other job, you go in and you're told, this is how you do this job. And, now we as writers, we get to, we think of them in terms of real people in our heads, but that still doesn't stop us from putting them through hell, and generally being happy about doing that.
Well, and if you put them through hell and then you provide a satisfying resolution, that's what readers call a good story. And then go out and buy the next thing that you write.
Hopefully.
Character in it. Yeah. But it does seem like, given the staggering success of these movies, which are all going to have sequels, that they've had plenty of time to plan a big push with not only Black Panther, but Marvel's other Black characters around the release of at least the second movie, or maybe in the lead up to it. And that just doesn't seem to be much of a consideration, not just at Marvel, but at the corporate offices in general. There's another Aquaman movie in production and the book is dead. So,
Well, there's a perception in comics fandom. It may be that way in the companies too, but there are A-list characters, there are B-list characters, there are C-list, etc. Sometimes they focus so much on the A and B list characters that the success of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I think, works because they didn't have their A and B listers to play with when they started. Iron Man was not an A-list character when they made that movie. People tend to forget now because it's been over a decade. Iron Man was a gamble. Not only was it a character most people weren't aware of, Robert Downey Jr. was a gamble at that point in time.
Yep.
Because he had a reputation. So there was a lot of factors Jon Favreau was not as established a filmmaker as he is now. There was a lot of gambles there, but I think that helped them because had they have gone in and started with Spider-Man comes with more caveats of what you can and cannot do. Whereas Iron Man was a bit of a blank slate and they could mold things how they needed them for the movie. And I think they can do that with characters like Wanda, Vision, Monica, perfect example, because most people like you said, have no idea who she is. Unlike me, when I first saw her in Captain Marvel as a kid, I'm like, I'm geeking out over stuff like that. Cause if you'd have told 10-year-old me that one day I would be watching, watching a TV show that's like popular and people are talking about it around the world with the Scarlet Witch and Vision and Monica Rambeau Captain, if you'd have told me that, I would have never believed it, because those were the characters that I grew up reading, in the Avengers and loved them.
Well, that's actually a good point to transition into a discussion of young Monica Rambeau in Captain Marvel and then older Monica Rambeau in WandaVision. So let's talk about the movie first, because there's really not a lot to talk about with the movie. What did you all think of the device of having her mother be Carol's best friend and flying buddy, and then having Monica be the child and Aunt Carol? And apparently, judging from what I saw online, a lot of people expect that to carry over to the comic books, which of course it doesn't.
Right. I love the dynamic of Monica and her mom with Carol. I think Monica's relationship with Carol was more impactful because she was seeing this superpower that she had with that child's innocence and that child's glee. And the scene where they're sitting on the porch and she's playing with the colors of the costume. Mm-hmm. It's a beautiful scene. You know, at the end of does it really move the story? Not really, but it's a beautiful scene that I would hate to see go away. And we do get some hint in WandaVision that, you know, their relationship is not, you know, as cordial now, you know, because I guess, you know, Monica, or I'm sorry, not Monica, Carol leaves at the end of that movie and doesn't come back until, you know, Infinity War, end of Infinity War. So I imagine there's some abandonment issues there with Monica, and you know, so I'm curious to see how that plays out in the new movie.
Yeah, and you know, it's a much more profound relationship, I think. Having Monica show up as a kid and interact with Carol, you know, this is not just my cool aunt. This is my cool aunt who flies through space and defeats alien overlords. You know, like, talk about hero worship. Because, you know, ordinary people look up to members of their families and expect them to know what to do in any given situation, depend on them for help in a crisis. They don't know that adults are all just making it up as we go along. But you know, to have the superhero powers and mantle of that added to it, I'm pretty sure that when Monica's mother developed cancer, because that is what she died of, cancer, didn't she?
I believe so. Yep.
She was thinking, I bet Carol could come back and take care of this. She can, you know, she's a super soldier, energy. What's it? I bet she could come back and fix this one really mundane problem. And she doesn't. So yeah, I mean, the sense of betrayal, I think, is going to be something to deal with.
Especially once you get to, we haven't addressed it yet, but when she finds out that Carol did come back and saved half the population of the planet, or helped save half the population of the planet, you know, because that's something I'm sure we've not seen the last of, is Monica's, you know, emotional responses to the fact that she wasn't there when her mom died because she had been, you know, gone in the snap. That's stuff I suspect that those things will continue to play over these movies for
Well,
a
it'd be a
while.
really poignant story if Carol had come back, and you know, she can blast moons to bits. That's not necessarily the same as being able to focus your energy to a very narrow part of the human body and destroy something.
Mm-hmm. Well, what's the really weird part is if Monica gets the powers like they are in the comics, Monica could have done that. You know, because Monica had the different types of radiation she could turn into, and you know, she could do all of that. So yes, had she had gotten her powers earlier, she probably could have fixed the problem. But that's also one of those things that it becomes you have to be careful, because if suddenly you have a character that can just cure cancer, then the next question is, well, why aren't you out there helping other people? You know, so as writers, we have to be careful how we introduce those things, because then it's like, you know, why don't you ever do that again? You know?
Yeah, like the freaking time turner
Yeah.
could have solved every problem in Harry Potter. Anyway, that's actually like a huge pet peeve of mine that relates to superheroes losing their powers. I hate stories where superheroes lose their powers. If you don't want to write a story about somebody with superpowers, don't create a superhero. And that leads into characters, protagonists. It's okay if villains are hugely powerful, but if you've got a hero that's hugely powerful, then it becomes really difficult to write stories for them. You know, if you've got somebody that's an immortal being of pure energy, well, they can solve most problems that the world has. And one conclusion that gets arrived at is, oh, well, let's take those powers away. Well, you shouldn't have given them to her in the first place. Instead of making an all-powerful superhero vulnerable to the color yellow, Why don't you make him vulnerable to bullets?
Or the character that
That's
constantly complains about their power, loses their power, and then goes and gives it back to themselves, you know. I hate being like this. I hate being like this. Oh, I lost it. Let me go get that back.
Yeah. Yeah. Instead of, hey, I'll go get a job selling insurance.
But even if you have I hate these powers, they're gone, oops, I want them back. Even that story could be interesting if it had character development in it.
I mean, it's been done. I mean, Ben Grimm is probably a great example of that. Who he finally becomes human.
Oh, I missed that altogether.
Yeah, he finally becomes human for whatever reason, and that's when something happens that, holy crap, I'm the only one that could have solved it, and now I can't. So it's just like, watch the world burn or become a monster again. And so there's a really great story early in the Fantastic Four run when Stanley and Jack Kirby were still doing it, where that's the whole thing is Ben's internal fight about this, and he finally realizes that, like, the world needs me, I'll just be a monster, and he goes off and saves the world. Then he spends the next 100 issues complaining about being a monster. But
Dan, did you want to add anything? I'm sorry.
No, I'm just laughing.
Okay. But,
this is why they don't hire me to write the Fantastic Four.
Well, and now your opinion is out there in a public forum about that. So
it's okay. I still love them, but it's just it's just one of those things. And like I said, stories are cyclical too, because these characters have been going on and on and on so long that eventually you're going to tell a version of the same story again.
Gail Simone described comic books a couple of years ago in a really interesting way, and I wish I could remember it. The problem with Twitter is if I go to her feed, there are like 10,000 tweets between that one and where it would be today. But she described it as something like an unending tapestry embroidered by different people in turn. And I thought that was a really good description for comic book series.
Yeah, because when you're writing comics, you don't end it. I mean, you can end a storyline, but that for the most part, when you're done with this book, like when you were writing Firestorm, you knew when you were done, somebody else was probably going to take over writing the character.
Oh yeah, well, I got fired off writing Firestorm. There was no question they were giving it to someone else.
Yeah, so it's one of those things. So it's hard to get attached to that idea of, if somebody hired me tomorrow to write the Fantastic Four, I know I'm not writing their final adventure.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen. So you're writing stories knowing that a couple of things will probably happen. When you're done, someone else will continue going, and somewhere down the line, some writer's going to go, I'm going to undo that story he did. It's going to happen. So you just kind of have to know that going in.
Yeah. Well, since we're talking about Monica and WandaVision, when she first made her appearance, was the direction her character took what you expected at that moment, or was it something totally different from what you had thought might happen?
I didn't know what they were going to do. I tried very hard to avoid anything before watching it because I just wanted to watch it. I do like what they did, that based on their experiences in the Captain Marvel movie, that her mother helped build this organization and that she was a part of it and that she kind of followed in her mother's and her aunt's footsteps. So I really liked that. I thought, and I thought she was a pretty cool character. I didn't know what was going to happen when she, got into the meat of the story, but I think they handled it really well.
Yeah. She seems really driven and pretty selfless. She knew what needed to be done, and they were like, you realize you're messing with your atomic structure here. She was like, oh, well, that's the price I got to pay because this has to happen.
That's that hero thing you were talking about earlier, Yeah. I don't know what it's going to do to me, but this has to happen. And yeah,
Yeah.
So, and there was a lot of good stuff, in WandaVision too, that, I think Marvel does a good job with their secondary characters. It didn't have to be, oh, I'm blanking on his name, the agent, or Darcy. It didn't have to be them.
Mm-hmm.
That could have been brand new characters, but the
Mhm.
fact that it was them, and those characters were characters we knew, and kind of gave us our in for the story. Yeah, they've done a really good job with making it feel like a comic book universe, because we reading comics, we're used to that. A character is in this book shows up in this book, and that's how we all knew they lived in the same world. So.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything else that you all would like to discuss about Monica before we wrap up tonight?
I think she's a cool character. I think if anyone's interested in reading her adventures, she was in the Avengers for quite a while in the 80s, and I think right up into the late 80s or early 90s. Some of that is available in trades and collections, and if you're interested in learning more, that's probably the best place to do it.
I just think she's been a great character since her creation. And in 1982, 81, you say 81 or 82?
82. 82.
82. Showing up and taking the name of a very well-established white male character, I think that's the kind of thing that if it happened today, there would be a huge outcry from certain segments of the fandom. And I think it was a really bold thing to do in 82. So, hats off to everyone involved in that decision. And, I am 100% for as much diversity as we can get, because when I was doing, when it was announced that I was going to be doing this new take on Firestorm, I would be at conventions or whatever, and there'd always be somebody in the audience like, "Hey, why did you make him a black guy?" Well, why not? I mean, is the metagene the thing that allows you to become a superhero? Is the metagene exclusive to Caucasians? I don't think so.
And we've seen that story. We've seen that guy, that guy's story.
Yeah. And you look at the world around you, and not everyone looks like Casper Van Dien. That's a random name to pull out, but he's like Mr. Aryan white guy. Why shouldn't the world in comics be as diverse as the world around us? It's okay. Well, this is an odd example. I just found out the most amazing thing about Singapore. Most housing in Singapore is public housing, but it's really nice. But every building that's public housing, it's mandated by the government that the demographics of people who live there have to reflect the demographics of Singapore as a whole. So whether it's like 82% native Singaporeans, Singapore natives, and then 10% somebody else, I'm bad at math. Anyway, it reflects the country that you're in. Why shouldn't the population of the fictional America look just like the population of the real America? It's a great thing. I think Monica Rambeau is a great example.
I also think too, we've talked about the character, but the way she was drawn as well, that costume, to be such a simple costume.
Mm-hmm.
It's just two colors. It's black leggings and white, the white top and cape, all that. It looks great. It's a fantastic design, and it also works well with her power sets. A lot of times in the comics, if she could change into various forms of radiation, and so her form would go from like human into like a line of color or whatever, of whatever radiation she was. And so the simplicity of the costume made the morphing of her human form into the radiation form work really well. and I just thought the artist, I'm not sure exactly who designed that. I know the original artist, I believe, was John Romita Jr., but I don't know if he designed the costume. But it's a beautiful costume, and what she wears in WandaVision is close.
Yeah.
There is at the end after she goes back in the second time, it's very, very close.
Yeah, Marvel's been really good about like giving hints at the original costume, like George Batroc in Captain America with the purple jacket with the yellow lines. Yeah.
Well, what you said about her transformation when she becomes particular kinds of energy reminded me of one of the moments I really loved from the books that I read researching this panel. She was taken over by somebody called the controller, who had a chip in her head, and she had to do whatever the controller said, including attack the Avengers. But at one point she used X-ray energy, which allowed Vision to see the chip, and being Vision, reach in and pull it out. So she saved herself, even though she could not avoid doing what the controller wanted her to do. And I read that moment and I thought, oh boy, that's really cool. I really like that.
Yeah, there's a great story. It's a crossover between the Avengers and the Fantastic Four, where this force field has been placed that comes out of the Fantastic Four's headquarters and starts pushing out, and there's no way to get through it. They're trying everything, nothing, they can't get through it. And she goes up into space and goes and flies around the sun to pick up speed. And as she comes back, she transforms into these different energies, so that when she hits the field, she is like a tiny beam, and she is able to puncture it. And then she comes in, stops, and no problem. But it's a beautifully drawn like page of her, doing all of that. And it just, it's a cool power set. And she's like Carol, in the comics, she's great for putting her out in space.
Well, I'm really hoping that we get to see a little bit more of a friendship between them, because for me, there are not enough really close friendships between women in the comics. The bromance is much more common than its female equivalent. And I really liked those few minutes in the Ultimate comic with between the two of them. So that's just my plug. If anybody's listening and cares, that's my thinking. But I think we've covered everything. And so if you all would like to tell people what your latest project is and where they can find you, that would be great. Dan, do you want to start?
Sure, you can find me at www.danjolley.com, and that Jolley is Jolley. And I'm on Facebook. I think it's dan.jolley1. It's my face. And my latest book is coming out October 14th. It's debuting at Multiverse, a con in Atlanta. It's coming out from Falstaff Books, and it's my first ever high fantasy novel. It's a hybrid fantasy detective story called The Rune Master Homicide. And I'm really, really freaking excited about that.
That is cool.
That's great.
I love that title. That's really cool. Yeah.
Thank you.
BobbyNash.com is my website. I'm also all over social media. Author Bobby Nash on Facebook, Bobby Nash on Twitter, and Bobby Nash Writes on Instagram. I'm currently working on some serialized novels for Patreon that once I finish will come out with these guys over here, the sequels to those books. And I'm also writing, in the process of writing a tie-in thing that hasn't been announced yet, so I can't say the name of, but it's a cool title. And more stuff with Domino Lady. So keeping me busy.
Well, and you can find me at www.nancynorthcott.com or here on ConTinual, the con that never ends. And I'd like to thank both Dan and Bobby for joining me for this panel, and thank everyone who has watched it and joined us. And finally, to thank our sponsors, Heroes Aren't Hard to Find and the Heroes Convention. For more information, you can find them at www.heroes.com. And that'll wrap it up for us tonight.